Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. This is Ancient Mysteries Unearthed. Welcome to another episode of the Fireside Chats podcast. Now, you might be recognizing a slightly different introduction today because it is just myself, Chris Noble, hosting the show today. My wonderful co-host Brandon James Sim is elsewhere on an adventure on planet Earth, or maybe another planet. Who knows? Tune into the next episode to find out where this wonderful soul is adventuring. So for today's episode, I'll be taking you through some pretty incredible research done by a gentleman named Michael Cremo, and he has a very famous book called Forbidden Archeology. And this book, Forbidden Archeology, is an amazing look into what he calls extreme human antiquity. So this episode today, we're going to be looking at some unbelievably compelling evidence to support the fact that human beings have actually existed as we are today, the anatomically correct human, the human that you and I and all of us on this planet see today, has actually existed on this planet way, 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 way longer than we were once told. And Michael Cremo's work is pretty unprecedented. He's also been presenting this work for many, many decades. And what I'm going to do today is play one of his lectures through the YouTube channel Megalithomania. That's a mouthful. I believe that's the channel run by Hugh Newman, and they do really wonderful conferences. So we're going to take a look at Mr. Cremo presenting at one of these conferences, and I'm going to be stopping it throughout. We're going to get, of course, just snippets of the conference, of the lecture. The full version, of course, is going to be down in the description below, so check that out if you want to watch the full lecture, which of course I always recommend that you wonderful folk check that out, because there's always so much more detail that we can get in that we can't get into in these episodes. Even though these episodes are 45 minutes to an hour long, it's not nearly enough time to get into all the juicy stuff that's out there. So without further ado, let me start things off with Mr. Michael Cremo introducing his work, and also his research approach is very important to listen to. The documents that he sources for all the information he's presenting are scientifically sound. He goes to the original papers, and I'll let him explain his process, but his research process alone is really interesting. Now, Michael Cremo, in my opinion, maybe isn't always the most exciting presenter in terms of his energy levels, but the information is so incredible. Just keep that in mind. It's all about the information here. Other presenters sometimes have a bit more, tenacity, but Cremo, his research speaks for itself. So without further ado, let us take a look. Let's take a look at what he does in his research and what that has already led him to learn about the academic community and about so much in the scientific world that we're dealing with. He has a concept called knowledge filtration that I think a lot of you will be really intrigued to hear more about. So here we go, Michael Cremo.
So I'm a researcher in human origins, but my work in human origins is inspired by my studies in the, whoops, wrong button. Is inspired by my studies in the Puranas, which are the historical writings of ancient India. However, interestingly enough, I've been invited to present these ideas at some of the leading scientific institutions in the world, like the Royal Institution in London, the Russian Academy of Science in Moscow, the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, and I'm very honored to be here speaking to you tonight. The question I'm looking at is, how old is the human species? Most scientists today would say the first humans like us, Homo sapiens sapiens, appeared less than 200,000 years ago. But the Puranas say that humans have existed for more than 200,000 years, going back perhaps hundreds of millions of years. So if what the Puranas is true, you could make a prediction that there should be reports of archaeological evidence for humans existing much further back in time than 200,000 years ago, perhaps going back many millions of years. So my methodology for testing this prediction has been to examine all archaeological reports from the time of Darwin to the present. So I divide the scientific literature into two categories, the primary and secondary scientific literature. The primary scientific literature means reports by archaeologists, geologists, paleontologists, published in their professional peer-reviewed scientific literature. Secondary literature is based on the primary literature. It would include textbooks, for example. Now, my first finding is perhaps not so surprising. There are no reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the current secondary literature, textbooks, for example. But my second finding is a little more interesting. There are many reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity in the primary scientific literature, past and present. And I've collected those reports in this book for Forbidden Archeology, which is 900 pages long. Some people call it forbidding archaeology. A bit too heavy to pick up. So we brought out a shorter edition of the book called The Hidden History of the Human Race, which is available this evening. So if this evidence really is there in the primary scientific literature, the question arises, well, why don't we see it in the secondary literature, the textbooks today? And I think that's because of a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the scientific world. And that blue box represents the dominant consensus in a scientific discipline about a particular question, in this case, human origins. And this idea of a dominant consensus is related to the concept of a paradigm. Paradigm is a term that was introduced by the philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn in his important book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And in that book, Kuhn said, in the absence of a paradigm, all the facts that could possibly pertain to the development of a given science are likely to seem equally relevant. But when you've got a paradigm in place, a dominant consensus about a particular question like human origins, and you have a dominant consensus that suggests humans like us are a fairly recent appearance on this planet, when you have such a consensus, when you have such a paradigm, there is some basis for scientists who are committed to that paradigm to make judgments according to their preconceptions about different categories of evidence that come to their attention.
So, you know, that's still quite a bit right there. And I wanted to jump in because what Michael Cremo is really talking about here is so important. And it so speaks to everything that we go over on this channel, which is the paradigm. The paradigm that we're taught in school, the paradigm that we're taught through mainstream media, whatever platform you're getting your historical information from. That is the paradigm we're looking at. You know, humans have only been around for so and so such and such long amount of time. All right, we're saying roughly 200,000 years at this stage, and as we're going to see more in this episode today, that's going to be blown out of the water completely. And we see this all the time. Doesn't matter what the topic is. We see this all throughout science. We see this all throughout academia, It's if you go up against the major consensus, the major paradigm, even with perfectly sound evidence, you get there's always pushback, and if anything, it's just pure straight up rejected. And you could also lose your job. I mean, there's a lot of negative ramifications for just presenting new information. And that's been happening throughout human history. We know this from Galileo times. We know this through Copernicus. We know this through so many historical figures in the scientific world that have had the exact same situation happen, where now we completely accept all of their scientific proposals or theories that are now completely accepted, but at the time were completely rejected. So take that into consideration. And I'm sure you're already on that wavelength if you're watching this channel. And if you've liked and subscribed, which if you haven't, please do. It helps us out so much, supports the algorithm. And guess what? Algorithm's not on our side here on YouTube, which is why we're also on Rumble. But if you like and subscribe, and even just those little comments, it really helps us, because the algorithm is also attached to a specific paradigm. The algorithm of YouTube is relating to a different paradigm, the paradigm that we're taught in the mainstream. And when we talk about different paradigms, the algorithm on YouTube does not want to support those paradigms. So channels like Ancient Mysteries Unearthed and other ones like that don't do as well in the searches and in the algorithms, because companies like Google don't want these new paradigms to really be discussed because of this whole knowledge filtration situation. So it's something that, Michael Cremo brings up, and it's a really valid point, and it's a really interesting way that he explains how our perspective is everything when it comes to anything in reality, and especially our history. And so let's look into some more of the evidence that he now goes into. So he talked about those primary and secondary documents. The secondary documents are basically what he looks at for all of this evidence to support extreme human antiquity. And these secondary documents are the scientific journals, the scientific papers, probably the most important documents to be looking at when it comes to anything in science and in academia, because it hasn't yet gone through that knowledge filtration system, or at least it has a lot less. It's done so a lot less before it makes its way into textbooks or mainstream publications. So we're going to look at some of these incredible examples that he's going to now list, and we're just going to go chronologically with some pretty old dates to even more extreme old dates to even more extreme old dates. So just buckle up. And again, maybe not the most bit monotone of a presentation, but hey, we're not judging Mr. Cremo for anything specifically as well. His performance, he's not an actor, he's an amazing researcher. So let's just listen to the research that he's done and take it in, because it's pretty mind-blowing. Let's go back now to this presentation and see where Mr. Cremo takes us.
And what to speak of being present in North America. The dominant consensus now is that there are no humans in North America any earlier than about 20,000 years ago. So Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues decided to independently publish the age for the site, which they did in this scientific journal. But when they did that, they experienced an extreme negative backlash from their colleagues in the scientific world, because they had dared to publish something that radically contradicted the dominant paradigm. Virginia Steen McIntyre wrote, "Not being an anthropologist, I didn't realize how deeply woven into our thought the current theory of human evolution has become. Our work at Huayatlaco has been rejected by most archaeologists because it contradicts that theory, period."
So I forgot to preface this particular part with, this is an example of knowledge filtration and the ramifications of this knowledge filtration. So this is a really great example of the Virginia Steen McIntyre, who was doing amazing work and found at an anthropological dig, and it was very professional, all properly done. She found some dates of human bones, I believe, or it was a footprint, something indicating, again, the Homo sapiens sapien, and the dates that her and her team ran professionally, as professional as you could possibly have it. The dates were just too old. They were rejected. And she just submitted her work just as it was, as you should do in the scientific world. and it was rejected. And then here's the backlash. So Mr. Cremo is just explaining this is what can happen when you present information and just facts and science, but when it hits against that paradigm, watch out.
So here's a more recent example of this knowledge filtering process. In 2013, archaeologists discovered footprints at Happisburg in the United Kingdom. The footprints were found in deposits that were between 780,000 and 1 million years old. The archaeologists very carefully studied the footprints. For example, they measured what they call the foot index, in which you divide the width by the length and multiply by 100. The average foot index for the 152 Happisburg prints was 39, which is just about the same as the foot index of living populations of anatomically modern humans. Now, of course, the archaeologists did not believe that anatomically modern humans were present in Europe almost 1 million years ago. So they decided to attribute the footprints to a hominin that they believe existed in Europe at that time, Homo antecessor. So this is one way in which the knowledge filtration process works. Scientists will interpret evidence in a way that doesn't violate their expectations. And we all have expectations that determine the way that we look at things. For example, many people will look at these cards and see nothing wrong with them, but actually they're altered, and this is part of a famous psychological experiment that was carried out. You know, the researchers took a deck of cards, a normal deck of cards, and then they altered some of the cards, like you see the...
Basically, what we can see, right, is the what was supposed to be the red six of spades, for example, is supposed to be black, right, and it's red. And when you first look at that, you're just assuming, based on our assumptions with the classic card game, that it is just the correct color, right? And of course, when you actually look at it, you're like, oh my god, it's reversed, right? The colors are reversed. And it's just a nice example of the psychology, right? The psychology behind knowledge filtration, and why with paradigms, we just look at, when you look at something with a perspective, that's kind of what you're going to see. And so on this channel, one of the biggest things that I want to be doing with all of our content here on Ancient Mysteries Unearthed is to open up these perspectives, because I'm not claiming, none of us here at Ancient Mysteries Unearthed are claiming to have the answers. We're just asking questions. That's really more what we're doing here, presenting information and asking a ton of questions, because in my mind, there's so many more questions than answers. And that's part of the fun. That's part of the amazing uncovering that we get to do with our human history and our human origins. So without further ado, now we can get into some more of the evidence. We were getting right into the beginning of that. We have some evidence of those footprints, right, with 1 million years ago, 700,000 to 1 million years ago. So now we're seeing, okay, like we've gone from 200,000, we're pushing it to 700, we're pushing it to 1 million. What else can we possibly discover? Because now here's the thing, right? When we go back to, where's Michael Cremo coming from with all this research? Well, he's going from the Vedic texts, the ancient Indian Vedic texts, right, where we get the Bhagavad Gita and all these other books, all these other religious texts that talk about, these flying vimanas and these gods having galactic wars and wars on planet Earth. And the stories are amazing, nuclear bombs getting blown up in ancient history. And the cool thing, well, the interesting thing about those ancient texts is the more we look into these myths, these quote unquote fictional crazy stories from our ancestors, well, we're finding more fact, right? We know with the nuclear wars that we hear about in the Veda text, well, we know that like there's a lot of physical evidence to support that those actually happen. You have vitrification, melted rock turned into glass, found throughout these areas that are also mentioned in these Veda texts. So Mr. Cremo is looking at these ancient myths and actually going, well, what if there's some truth to this? And I think that's where we got to start asking those questions with a lot of these myths, right? We know with the Great Flood, the biblical flood, there's so much evidence now supporting that actually happened 12,500 years ago. So it's the same kind of thing with human antiquity. Are we actually, or are we only 200,000 years old, or have we been on this planet for millions and millions of years, like some of these ancient texts, like the Vedas talk about? And I think the Sumerian clay tablets also do push back human existence. At the same time, I think the Sumerian clay tablets do harp more on the fact that humans were created about 250,000 years ago. So there is some contradictory information. Hey, that's what we're doing here. We're just presenting it and asking the questions and seeing where things kind of align and where they don't necessarily align. So let me know in the comments below if you're kind of vibing with Mr. Cremo's information, and if you think any of it resonates with some of the research that you've been doing. Let's take another look now at more examples of ancient human antiquity.
So I think we've got evidence here for a human presence going back 3 million years. In 1867, Robert Collier, a medical doctor, reported on a fossil human jaw from Suffolk, from a place called Foxhall. This anatomically modern human jawbone from Foxhall was also found in the Red Crag Formation. It's kind of close by Walton on Naze. And later, in the early 20th century, J. Reed Moore of the Prehistoric Society of East Anglia did further research at Foxhall. He found stone tools and weapons, signs for the deliberate use of fire. And the American anthropologist and archaeologist Henry Fairfield Osborn wrote in Natural History, "The discoveries of J. Reed Moore bring indubitable evidence of the existence of man in southeast Britain before the close of the Pliocene." So the Pliocene closes at 2.58 million years ago, and these discoveries of human bones and human artifacts go back before that.
So once again, he's just using these academic, secondary academic, these journals, right? These scientific journals. And what is he seeing more of? Now we're getting pushed back to 2.5 million years ago. And one of the big ways that they're clearly doing this is through geology, right? The geological record is helping them because with geology, we are able to date these different periods throughout Earth's history. And then when we find a human bone inside one of these pieces of geology of either rock, dirt, sediment, whatever, then we're able to conclude that, wow, this human bone, this jawbone, for example, it must be at, roughly around this 200 million years, because that's the geology we're finding around it. And if you watch the full length of this lecture, Michael Cremo also does go into the geology and how it's kind of foolproof, in the sense that there's really no other way that bone could have got there. Because that's the thing is like, to debunk that, be like, well, the bone could have been placed there later in time. It's like, no. The way that they found these bones indicates that it was naturally there. And there's a whole process and an explanation for that I recommend, of course, everyone look into by watching the full length version of this lecture. So let's keep her going. And more amazing, compelling evidence of human antiquity.
The Italian geologist Giuseppe Ragazzoni found human skeletal remains in a formation about 4 million years old at a place called Castanedolo in northern Italy. I went to Castanedolo and I met this gentleman there, and he gave me a copy of a rare geological report about these discoveries. So we relocated the place where the discoveries were made. Now, when some scientists hear that a human skeleton was found in layers of rock 4 million years old, they say this is very easy to explain. Maybe 4,000 years ago, somebody died on the surface, and then they put the skeleton down in that very ancient layer of rock, and that's why you think you've found a human. Yeah, this sometimes happens when you put a PC production on a Mac. But I think you get the point that, they say, okay, it's a burial, it's an intrusive burial. The skeleton really doesn't belong in the layer in which it was found. But Ragazzoni, the discoverer, was a professional geologist, and he was very much aware of this problem. And he said, okay, if it had been a burial, then the layers of rock above the skeleton would have been disturbed, as we see here. But he looked very carefully when he was taking the skeletons out of the ground, and he could see that all the layers of rock above the skeleton were intact and undisturbed, indicating that the skeletons really were as old as the layers of rock in which they were found, in this case 4 million years old. Now, there's been a recent discovery that kind of confirms the existence of a human presence going back 4 to 5 million years or even further. And these are footprints that were discovered at a place called Trachylos in Crete. The discovery was announced this year. There were 50 footprints found. Some of them were small, 3.7 inches, but some of them were larger, 8.8 inches. This was published in the Proceedings of the Geological Association. The footprints had human-like features, short toes, the first toe larger than the others, the first toe non-divergent, in other words, in line with the others, an evident ball of the foot. But the scientists who discovered these things could not really accept that humans like us were present to make these footprints, so they suggested they must have belonged to some kind of creature like they suggested Ardipithecus ramidus, who was known to exist in Africa.
I mean, that proposal's crazy. Look at the feet of the Ardipithecus ramidus. Like, look at the feet. Those are not human feet, not even close to human feet. If that's the best explanation, I don't know, guys. I don't know. Not sure about that one. So anyway, we're going to keep it going here. So I like, again, there's an explanation for you right there of the geology behind some of these findings and how we know that it's not just, again, like he said, a burial, for example. And there's just so much more. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming just in this lecture alone, if you watch it, or if you buy Mr. Cremo's book, Forbidden Archeology, which is going to be linked in the description below. Check it out. I have that book, the short version, not the long version. The short version is already long enough. And because there's so much evidence, that's why it's so insanely long. And hey, that's the beauty of the situation is it's overwhelming. The evidence is overwhelming. So let's look at more of it.
Some years ago, I was giving a lecture about my work in Moscow, and I met this former Russian naval officer who gave me this piece of amber. And this piece of amber was something that he found in Kaliningrad, which is near Lithuania and Poland, up there in the Baltic Sea. And the interesting feature of this piece of amber is in the circled area there. This is a magnification of it. You can see a kind of fabric there. And this is even a higher degree of magnification. You've got some kind of fiber that is woven into a fabric that is embedded in this piece of amber. Now, according to the modern scientific understanding, weaving of cloth is something that began only about 15,000 years ago in the Neolithic. But the Baltic amber is about 44 million years old. In the 19th century, gold was discovered in California. Miners went there to get it, to places like Table Mountain in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And they dug tunnels into the sides of the mountains. And deep inside the tunnels, the miners found human bones and human artifacts. They were found in layers of rock that belonged to the early part of the geological period called the Eocene, which means these things would be about 50 million years old.
I mean, wow. Yeah. Wow. It's amazing. We've got one more video where Michael concludes with some more amazing evidence and kind of concludes his thoughts here. So let's get into that, and then we'll, wrap up the episode for today. But just kind of keep marinating with these ideas of like, we just keep pushing everything back with our history, whether it's human antiquity and extreme human antiquity, like we're going on today in our episode, or other things, the structures that we find all around this world. The more we look into them, the further back we're pushing the dates. Everything is going further back in history, and it's far more incredible, of course, being all this high advanced technology that was certainly existing in the distant past. There's just so much we don't understand. There's so much that we still have yet to learn about who the heck we are as a species. So let's watch Michael's final thoughts and some more incredible evidence that is just in the insane time period of how old we could be as a species. Who really knows? Let me know in the comments below what you guys think.
Now, this is a pretty extreme case even for me, but in 2000, a woman named Paulina Zelinsky from Canada and her husband, who run a company called Advanced Digital Communications, were doing underwater research for the Cuban government, trying to locate sunken Spanish galleons off the coast of Cuba. And in their sonar search of the ocean bottom, they got images of structures on the sea bottom. And some of the imagery showed what appeared to be a city with massive stone structures. And this was found in the waters off the western tip of Cuba. And a proposal was made that these structures were erected on a land bridge that existed between Cuba and the Yucatan part of Mexico during the last ice age. During the ice ages, the water in the ocean is redeposited on the earth as ice. So that means the sea levels go down. So they thought, okay, during the ice ages, it was dry land, and that's when these structures were built. So that would be about 20, 30, 40, 50,000 years ago. But some skeptics announced, like even during the ice age, the sea levels were a maximum of 100 meters, about 328 feet lower, and these structures are found at a depth of 2,000 feet. So the skeptics proposed, okay, so these couldn't have been built during the ice age. They're at 2,000 feet, and that wouldn't have been exposed even during the time of lowered sea levels. So I thought, was there any time before that even that part of the Gulf of Mexico would have been dry land? So I did some studies in the geological history of the Gulf of Mexico. And it turns out that 195 million years ago, during the Jurassic period, the Gulf of Mexico was dry land. And around that time, there were some breaks in the coast of Mexico and off the coast of Florida, and water from the Atlantic and Pacific flowed into that basin and covered what was once dry land. So, is it possible that during the Jurassic period there was a human civilization that built those structures? For me, I think it's possible. This report from the Morrisonville Times tells of a gold chain that was found in coal 300 million years old. This iron pot was found in coal deposits, again about 300 million years old. This bell was found in coal deposits about 300 million years old. And there are scientific reports of anatomically modern human skeletons being found in coal deposits about 300 million years old. This report from Scientific American tells of a beautiful metallic vase that was found 15 feet deep in solid rock near Boston. And modern geologists say the formation at that depth, at that place, is about 600 million years old.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. So there you go. There's a lot of evidence already right there to sink your teeth into and follow up on. The nice thing about all of Michael Cremo's work, especially when you get his book, it's all cited. Of course, everything's referenced, so you can follow up on everything if you so choose to. And yeah, basically, this is what we're looking at. We're constantly pushing back the clock for how old we are as a species, and also how sophisticated we have been in the past. I'm glad that he touched on the Cuban ruins, the pyramids just off the coast of Cuba there. And we did an episode on underwater civilizations that touched on those sites, but we didn't actually get the types of dates and what the geology would have been and how far back the clock is pushed to a potential of when those sites could have been built. Now, that's also assuming that they were built by humans, right? And that's also assuming other things. So once again, we're really just asking questions more than anything here on this episode, and of course on every episode here on Ancient Mysteries on Earth. So please let me know in the comments below what you really what you thought of Mr. Cremo's work. What do you think of this extreme human antiquity? And what do you think about this knowledge filtration? Let me know your in the comments. What do you think about knowledge filtration? Where have you seen knowledge filtration used, and where it's being practiced in a almost sometimes it feels like in a religious sort of way? And before we end this episode, I wanted to read one of our favorite comments. As always, we really appreciate all you wonderful humans commenting, and we're still in the early phases of this channel, and yet we're really getting a lot of interaction with you beautiful folks. So thanks again for all the comments, all the have been having some direct messages, some emails from some of you, and it's just been really fantastic. So thank you. It's not only going to help the channel grow, but it's just really fun. It's really special. That's why I created the channel. It's why I created the whole organization, is to bring like-minded, curious minds like you to together in a community, and to further our understanding of who we are and what we can do to bridge that gap, and to bring this knowledge into our day-to-day life, and to just have a different perspective on who we are, because ultimately it tells a different story, and it tells a story that we're far more powerful. We are far more powerful and knowledgeable than we are led to believe. And that's a self-empowering thing. That's what we want to take forward from this, is that we are unbelievably powerful beings. So I wanted to take a moment to talk about one of our favorite comments here. So I'm just looking at a couple of them right now, and I'm just going to go ahead and pick one. And this one's going to be from Wix 2777 or Mies Weeks 2777. You know who you are. Thank you so much for your comment. Comment was great show, great format. We are in cycle number 7 of the processional years. the precession of the equinoxes of roughly 24,000 years, if counted according to the great year mentioned by Plato and others. So thank you for the compliment. Thank you for recognizing this was one of the Sunken Civilizations episode. Thank you for kind of connecting the dots, right? When we're talking about these precessional cycles, the cycles of civilization and the cycles of cataclysm that happened on our planet are very much aligned with this 24,000 year cycle. So thank you very much, Mies Weeks. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name there. Your YouTube name, of course. I'm assuming that's not your real life name. And thank you so much for the comment. We appreciate you. And for everyone else that, of course, has commented and left your likes and your subscriptions, all of those good things, really appreciate you. Thank you again. And make sure you check out our next episode, of course, Fireside Chats podcast here on Ancient Mysteries Unearthed. Until next time, much love and peace.